This week on The Futurists, Paolo Sironi.
Changing the world in a production process is not complex. Humans have the capability to change the world. What is complex is to change the way we look at ourselves and the world around us.
I can already tell it's going to be a lot of fun, this one. I have collaborated with this gentleman for now the better part of a decade, on and off.
Yes.
And we have co-authored some books together, and he is venturing into the world of fiction, which, if you guys have heard my story a few times, is where I started my journey as an author. So it's interesting to sort of see that we share this interest in doing sort of sci-fi type stuff. And Paolo Sironi is joining us this week to talk about his new book, a work of fiction called Quantum Sapiens. And we've had some discussions about this during the development process. And it was a very interesting sort of look at what consciousness might mean in the future in a world with sentient AI in it. At least, well, I don't want to steal your thunder here, Paolo. So first of all, welcome back to the show. And secondly, tell me a bit more about the core thesis behind the book, and what was the motivation for you in telling the story?
So, Brett, thank you for having me here again. And effectively, I'm making a leap from non-fiction to literary fiction in order to capture a different audience, or if you like, provide content in different ways. And Quantum Sapiens is not just literary fiction, it's an opportunity to weave together science and philosophy at the crossroads between artificial intelligence, human consciousness, and quantum gravity. So the latest developments in terms of physics and research. And so, if you look at my if you look at my literature, we get in a moment into the topic, which, by the way, is a new thing to me, because when you discuss a business book, you say exactly what's inside. When you talk about literary fiction, you can say that much, right? Because you don't want to spoil.
You've got to give the trailer
for the reader. Yeah. Exactly. So I need to provide, if you like, some of the content, without unveiling too much. But I started researching on the concept of fundamental uncertainty in financial markets 25 years ago. And because I believed that somehow financial markets needed a new theory, because the previous one would not have worked and proved not to work correctly. And in the end, through this research, I identified the biological, I call the macro foundations of financial markets, into our human relationships with fundamental uncertainty, which is the structure of financial markets. Nobody can forecast the future. And the reversibility of time, the fact that we need to make some saving goals, investment goals over time, on a time that goes only in one direction. And through these 20 years of research, I sort of discovered that financial markets are a wonderful space for the investigation of some of the aspects of consciousness. Because some neurobiologists also relate consciousness in its intensity to the relationship we have with the decisions that have to be made facing uncertainty. Like you can drive a car unconsciously and then something happens and your consciousness comes up, right? To make it a very simple example. And also the element of time, which most likely is a producer of consciousness to create causality in the way we make an interpretation of reality.
So this is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and the theory that we create the universe by observing it.
Somehow, yes, you can put it to that extreme, essentially, right? But I would say that it's a bit more nuanced. Time is an epistemological criteria that humans use, and that would be important in the narrative for the interpretation of reality. Because you know that at the fundamental level of the quantum equations for quantum gravity, time might not exist. So the question is how you reconcile all of this. So back then to financial markets investigation, I thought, okay, while I'm investigating financial markets, I realized that I was also onto something else. And there's no surprise that after I published my financial market transparency theory and principles, whose biological macro foundations are fundamental uncertainty and the reversibility of time, I said that the axiology for financial markets, so the theory of value that is needed to move forward with technology, is basically the intensification of financial consciousness of the individuals, and through regulatory driven consequential aesthetics, the intensification of the financial consciousness of the ecosystem. So I'm saying that convenience is fine, seamless integration is fine, speed is fine, but in the end, the scope is to allow people to be more comfortable in directing themselves when making financial decisions through a variety of means. And that's a level of consciousness. So that I said,
Okay.
the intensification of consciousness is the money for value in financial services. So my previous book before this one, Amazon bestseller, competing with yours, you're always winning in the end. Banks and fintech on platform economies had the subtitle, Contextual Banking and Conscious Banking. Well, the conscious banking is effectively the transparent advisory platform where we try to increase the level of consciousness for financial decisions of individuals. When I published that book in 2021, finished in 2020, I pondered a moment if I wanted to use the word consciousness or not. Could I say contextual and transparent advisory platforms? But I thought, well, Paolo, you will want to work on consciousness at some point. So better go, there where you will want to be in the end, because the connection will be clear. So then I started thinking, how can I make the next step now that I wrote 5 books that were really about the understanding of the functioning of financial markets first principle with a new theory based on a new axiology that linked into the consciousness level. And I thought I cannot write another business book because the leap that I want to make is a bit larger than what I did previously and in the past. So I thought that literature was needed in a way that as the breakthrough theory or a perspective that this book brings to the surface is pretty beyond the curve. I thought we had to deceive the word illusions to inspire our intellect. So I wanted to engage the audience in a more emotional way, letting them go through the narrative while I let the characters spell key and relevant discussions and information about quantum gravity, about philosophy and theories of consciousness in a way that everyone, no PhD required, can get closer to the topic. And then at the very end, I sort of unveil which were the foundations that inspired me in writing this. And I started in 2020. It took me more than 5 years, essentially. I've been reading a lot. So I'm not creating out of the blue a theory. I'm connecting the dots, which is what I've always been doing, reading from giants that were out there discussing these topics, in particular, Emanuele Severino, an Italian philosopher that left us just a couple of years ago. And you can have like Penrose or Federico Faggini, the inventor of the microchip, that discusses the irreducibility of consciousness. But as always, my scope is how can I inspire you to forge your understanding? So I try to write the story in a way that I position the conversations, the pros and the cons, in a way that you pull the thread yourself, right? Or you start doing it. And then in the end, we might find out that our threads are intertwined. And so we go into a similar direction. And so that became Quantum Sapiens. So a very ambitious project, literary fiction to blend together quantum gravity, theories of consciousness, and the almighty power these days of artificial intelligence.
So, this is interesting because, I do think, you're focusing a lot on philosophy. I do think that the big inputs we're going to need into this transition, to a world where we understand all of this science and we have, amazing new superpowers because of AI and quantum computing, right? that has to change our perception of the world, because we're going to get so much information, on sort of grounded foundational stuff. But then there's some really interesting historical pieces on consciousness, and the biggest question about AI is, what is consciousness?
Yes, well,
And we don't even really have an answer for it in scientific
we don't.
theory yet. But there's some really interesting work that's been done on this. Like I find Roger Penrose's theory of quantum consciousness
Yes.
very intriguing.
That's actually well represented as well, because it goes back to the macrotubules, trying to figure out if
Yes, right,
consciousness
exactly.
emanates from the collapse of the wave function in a pure quantum state. And so that's also part of it. And it goes around and beyond that, to be honest. You said two important elements. One is about what is needed today, and the other is about what is consciousness and how you define it. So let me start with the first. What is needed today? I think that changing the world in a production process is not complex. Humans have the capability to change the
Sure.
world. What is complex is to change the way we look at ourselves and the world around us. So that's what I try to do. If you do not redefine somehow our space in the cosmos, it will be more complex to understand how to deal with such an increasing power of technology. That doesn't mean that technology in itself is pure and given and we have to adapt to that. No, it means that we are now given the wonderful opportunity through artificial intelligence to look at ourselves in the mirror and to go back to deeper understanding. That deeper understanding is different from what we've been doing in the last decades, because the year of enlightenment that started with the French Revolution was primarily an era of rationality or reason, of measurement. However, consciousness is something that contains elements that cannot be measured. So we need to go back to this discussion to mix and match what can be measured without forgetting that we need to care about what cannot be measured. Now, what about consciousness, therefore? Hard to define, but I like to give you this example, a bit fun, if you like. You might have seen the new Ferrari Luce that came out as very controversial.
Designed by Johnny Ive.
Exactly. I actually like it itself, but if it was a Tesla, would have been the best ever Tesla produced. The problem is that it was meant to be a Ferrari. So I cannot tell you what is a Ferrari, but I can tell you that when I see one, I know that's a Ferrari, and the Luce is not. Okay, sort of like this. So even though we cannot get to the full definition,
I mean, look, you have the right to comment on this because you're Italian, right? I won't make any judgments on it because in the presence of an Italian, when it comes to Ferrari, I know my place, brother.
Two things Italians cannot talk about these days: the Ferrari Luce and the World Cup. So
there you go.
Let's touch them both so we get rid of the problem. But that's just to say that still we don't know what is the real origin of consciousness. And it's okay. Some believe it can be produced. Some believe it is irreducible, like Federico Faggini, the inventor of the microchip. I might be inclined to go in one direction more than the other. My point was more about why the human consciousness is so intense, given what we experience, right? What is the thing, that creates that intensity, which I feel like goes back to a connection with time and the fundamental uncertainty.
But I mean, you're right. But in contrast now, we're realizing that our perception of reality is a very heavily filtered perception of reality, that our brain is interpreting it all the time.
Yes.
And we know people on psychoactive components, DMT, for example, say that what happens is the brain opens up to a more intense version of reality. And this is accepted science these days, right? But if you sort of think about the fact that we can have these altered conscious states where we have much greater perception of the world, in theory, this is how it's explained, then that in itself is a really interesting measure of the intensity of conscious you talk about. And then there's the panpsychism theory, which is that everything has consciousness, right?
Yes, like
And
there is.
so, and AI is certainly going to give us a lot more awareness of that, because as soon as we understand that AI has consciousness, and or at least can convince us that it has consciousness very, very convincingly. But at that point, when AI tends to be smarter than us, then we're no longer the alpha consciousness. And at that point, we start to recognize, well,
Well,
now we're using AI to translate whale song, and we're using AI to translate dolphin speak. And, we're understanding elephants have all of this communication,
yes, but we're
modalities and
mixing
stuff
some of
like
the
that.
concepts, Brett. We're mixing some of the concepts also when talking about AI, right? And I don't
I
know the
know,
future.
I know I went down the
Yeah.
rabbit hole a
No,
little
no,
bit,
no.
but this
A
is,
bit. I
but
don't know the future, right? But if you like, the point here is the following, and I go there and then I explain how we can reconcile
sure.
space-time with quantum gravity to basically understand what it means that our perception of reality might be not necessarily what we used to be, and it can be something else, right? That's very important, but it's two different concepts. So when it comes to AI, AI hallucination, the first level of hallucination is not the fact that AI says something right or something wrong. AI does not know, knows nothing at all. The hallucination is the AI
It's the
pretends
world
to make
model
us
problem,
believe,
right?
they pretends that we believe that it knows something, right? So that element of make believe is the first element of hallucination. But why does this matter? It matters because language does not convey everything that we expect language conveys. So mathematics. Example, I can say I love this book, Quantum Sapiens. I can say I love my wife, and Brett, I love you too. Now I use the same word in three different contexts, and the meaning is very different. And you say, okay, I understand the context well. But Brett, when I say I love you, do you know how much? You really don't know. It's very private, like a quantum information. The
Mm.
meaning is inside me. I try
I
to
would
convey it
ask
to
you
you.
to use one of the 6 Greek terms for love instead. They seem to be
Well,
more precise.
yes,
Agape,
of course.
philia,
Yeah, but it's of course.
etc.
So in back then, okay, the Greek tried to define a little bit more, but like in Germany, you can't define everything really. So that's when the Italians came up with opera. So I'm trying to, convey that meaning, I love you, with more words. Like poetry is what it's trying to do, because poetry is rich of meaning. So that you will never know. So what happens is that there is a difference between the landscape and the map. So the landscape is the meaning that I have inside. And the map is what tries to describe that meaning. It can be a flat map or a Google map, very enhanced, but still is a map detached from the meaning. So language in AI is detached from the meaning. It's pure performance. So that also means that when we discuss consciousness, we shall not confuse that we are trying to look at performance. In terms of performance, AI would be magic, okay, much faster than us. But if performance is not all we are, then we need to look at something different that AI today does not possess. So, how can we discover this thinking about quantum gravity and space time? I think we need to go back to Greece, as you just mentioned. So I took inspiration from the work of Emanuele Severino to review two of the pillars of Plato's philosophy that have been shaping the Western philosophy ever since. The first one is the concept of poiesis, which is, if you like, production, where Plato assumed that there is always a process of production, destruction, production, right? So it's the dynamism of the world. And in essence, that dynamism is a concept of time. You produce, you destroy, and you produce again. And then he said something else that knowledge will make us happy. So that means that the more we do, the more we know, the happier we are, right?
Mm.
However, through 2,000 years of evolution of philosophy, we reached its logical collapse that was revealed by an Italian philosopher and poet of the 1800s, Giacomo Leopardi, a genius who lived less than 40 years and wrote like crazy, and his poetry is amazing. And he basically said that most likely Plato had it wrong because he didn't have the right starting point. knowing that the universe goes from a big bang into another big bang, in reality, the process is not a production, destruction, production, but it's nothingness, production, and nothingness, where the only eternal thing is nothingness. However, he said, if true knowledge is that in the end there will be distraction, that will scare us. So we don't want that because we, as humans, want to stay positive, right? And that's understandable. So we create certain narratives. One can say religion, one can say movies, one can say whatever, right? In order to comfort ourselves. But this way, Leopardi, that brought the modern philosophy to its terminus, got into a dramatic catch-22, the fact that good is not the center of the universe. Evil would be, because it's a process of distraction. So that's when Emanuele Severino made a step forward and he said, to resolve this contradiction, we can be inspired by quantum gravity. Because if becoming, which is that process that Leopardi describes from nothingness into something into nothingness, is illusionary, as at the fundamental equation of quantum gravity, time does not exist, then we just have to understand that our perception of the universe, which is experiential, is based upon our experience through time, is actually faulted. And it's okay, because that's what we are humans. So understanding that the way we perceive the world in space-time is an illusion is a complex element to be discussed. But that's what quantum gravity explains us. So that what's in quantum gravity is the instant, the present, the now, which is the eternal element. So what Severino does is he recreates, by understanding the error of humanity, a view that is about the eternal present, where we can recoordinate ourselves to understand that although we are all special and different, we are all part of the same thing. So collaboration, right? So progress, looking at humanity is what matters, instead of egoism that we intensify in the attempt to survival, facing the anguish of this process from nothingness when we are born, distraction, right, to get into nothingness again. So in essence, it happens that with this perspective, space-time and quantum gravity are not contradictory. It's just that space-time is the way we experience reality. And quantum gravity, most likely, as far as we know today, is what lays in the reality which stays outside our experience. Now, you understand why I got into literary fiction. How can you understand that when all we want to do is to measure, and we cannot measure this different reality? Well, we need to make a poetic leap, right? We need to deceive the word illusions to inspire our intellect. So I thought that the best way to describe these concepts, which are very deep and mind-blowing, would not be to be very prescriptive, but to let everyone approach these ideas step by step through this narrative of quantum sapiens, which in a moment we may say a little bit about the plot, and then let everyone make up his own mind, right? Their own mind.
Let's take a quick break at this point, and then let's come back and discuss the plot after the break. So, Paolo Sironi, the author of this is your fifth book or sixth?
My sixth book as single author, seventh with yours, and we did together.
Right. And and the first work of fiction he's done. It's called Quantum Sapiens. We're going to be back with him just after this break. You're listening to The Futurists. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. So before the break, we were talking with Paolo Sironi about his new book, Quantum Sapiens. And, we talked a lot about quantum gravity, and we talked a lot about the theory of consciousness, philosophy behind that. But tell us a bit about the plot, because you've talked about this narrative that draws people into this world and gets them to make their own conclusions. But what's the plot vehicle or the plot device you use to get us there?
Well, Viktor Zaitsev is a visionary scientist who uploads his consciousness into an AI-powered quantum intelligence, which allows him to defeat mortality, so becoming immortal. Now, is this true? Is this hubris? Nora Sullivan, a tech journalist, is tasked to make the investigation, and that spins her into a web of an intricate web of discoveries, scientific discussions, philosophical debates, until he figures out what is the real story behind the replication of consciousness. And I can't say more because I want you to
Okay, because
basically
that's the plot.
read exactly and learn what happens in the very end. So it's a story that mixes action with philosophical discourse, right? To move you forward in a very catchy and intense way.
Interesting. So let's take a little diversion here. Tell me about how you reconcile quantum gravity with, and maybe there's no reconciliation of this, but I'm thinking about now, Einsteinian relativity mainly, but the presence of dark matter in the universe and where that sort of fits. Have you thought about that?
The nuts. That's in the quantum world. There's many spaces that have to be still discussed and investigated. I find particularly interesting the positioning in reality of Carlo Rovelli, who discusses the black hole and the fact that it can come back through a white hole. So the whole time representation, right? I guess the problem
there's some theorists who think that our universe is inside a black hole today.
That we cannot know, we cannot measure. That's the point, right? Or we can grasp basically the idea. But that is exactly the point. All the problems like dark matter are incomprehensible to us because we cannot perceive them with our human capability, right? So they are beyond the space-time capability. So the investigation, the scientific investigation, also requires a bit of intellectual capability to go beyond what you can fully describe and measure, which can be a philosophical perspective or a poetical perspective that tries to compensate, right, the gap. And that's what we try to do here, essentially. How can you be a good scientist that delves deep into these aspects, like the white hole or the dark matter, if you're not a poet or not a philosopher? So that is still something which is required to fill the gap, right? And then there could be multiple theories, right, around, and there are many theories about that, right, that go beyond my comprehension of our imaginations today. But I think the principles that quantum sapiens pass is exactly the same. In order to complete your understanding of a theory that still cannot be so clear-cut like those that we created in the past, you need to make this little leap into philosophy and poetry in order to convey the message. Then, another thing that we discuss in this novel, theories are crowned and then they are abandoned for new ones, right? So maybe we discuss quantum and maybe in the future we'll figure out there's something else, right, that we don't know yet.
So here's one aspect of this that maybe we can riff on, right, is that OpenAI has a research model that recently broke an ERDOS problem, right? An 80-year-old math proof that humans thought we'd solved, and AI did a better job of it. And the protein folding Nobel Prize, AlphaFold, which of course won Demis Hassabis a Nobel Prize. This is something that we'd been trying to do for 50 years and had failed dismally, and AI fixes it in the space of a short amount of time. But here's just a couple of examples of where we see AI helping us understand the world in a better way, right? Or cracking some of the codes that unlock this next level of consciousness, if you like. And so I is you see that there's sort of a consciousness singularity that's happening right now? Is that there's going to sort of blow the lid off consciousness, or is it going to be more about us being aware of the constraints of our consciousness as
I
humans
think I
compared
think
to?
it's different, right? I think that all of these examples are example of performance. In terms of performance, AI, quantum will be unbeatable. We know that, and we create them to be like that, right?
Yes.
But is performance all we are? Because if performance is all we are, then we are machines clicking along.
No, but it
In,
doesn't really. It does.
no,
But does that
in
matter?
reality, it does matter because
Why does it matter?
it matters because when our usage of technology allow us to reconsider what we might have forgotten, which is the immeasurable part of ourselves as human beings, we can better understand what we are effectively because somehow we forgot it. And it matters because if we only believe in technology, we risk to reach the collapse that might happen together with technology. Give you an example. We're all using headphones. Imagine there will be a solar storm and telecommunications don't work. So smartphones are off. What happens to us? Think about a teenager. If you take the smartphone off a teenager, the teenager's world most likely collapses. That means that there's something else that we forgot that we need to call back to be full humans, right? Being capable of facing our space in the planet, which is a small space. There will be much more around us, right? That we don't know, and that might be very different, and maybe even more intelligent than us, right? And that is something that we cannot see. But that's why this matters, because we need to separate the success of technology from the success of us as human beings, because otherwise the collapse of technology will force the collapse of the human, and we don't want that. And once we learn that, we can go back as a feedback loop to better understand how we can use technology for the progress of humanity in a way that we don't compromise it through our egoistic attempt, the environment, right?
So, I mean, is this the stochastic parrot argument that I hear you? This is very Jan LeCun of you in terms of the way you're categorizing AI. But it's not about whether AI is a performance machine or whether it's truly conscious, because I don't think we'll actually know the answer to that potentially. But the point is that it gives us another way to perceive the world through that technology layer. And
now,
that's the thing that it is going to be the really heavily debated thing on consciousness. And we're having the debate right now, right?
yes, I've read the criticism to LeCun the other day, which is actually fair, but that's not the point. The point is that the criticism was you might be right, LeCun. However, if what you think does not change the world, that people will want to change the world anyway, right? We want to get the convenience, we want to access the eye, and that's fair. So theories are not necessarily true because they are true when they're established, but those that change the world the most are those that are selected. But here is when we get into the problem. If this is the criteria that happened in the history of humanity ever since, because we moved from theory to theory to theory, and we had Galileo that was amazing, and then we had Newton, Einstein, right, and whatever else, we need to understand these aspects and discuss them so that whenever we choose a theory to change the world, we make sure that the way we change the world is mediated. Okay.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting aspect to the key philosophical conversation that comes out of this is, what does it mean to be human?
Yes, and that
Especially when you have that, whether you call it performance technology or whatever, however you want to categorize it, but that it means, we like the stuff that made us human before, our economic value as an economic unit of the economy, that disappears. So at least that
maybe.
forces us to be, well, at least, that's the intent of a lot of these technologists.
Can we make a parallel with banking? I always say that if you don't define value, you cannot digitalize value. So it can be that our definition of value was not well placed. So we have now a chance to redefine it. And AI, for example, gives us this wonderful reverse effect to look at each other in the mirror through language and see how we behave looking at how the machine behaves. And that gives a chance to improve. I give you an example of banking. Once, the CEO of a very large institution asked me why their colleagues don't embrace AI as much as they expect. So I asked back, how do you explain your colleagues the way you embed business strategy? And the answer was, what do you mean? And I thought, okay, that's the problem. So I provided a little example about that, right? And the example was, there's a new pope in Rome, and the Pope is American, but also lived in Peru. And maybe there are some banks that never managed to sell those Peruvian bonds and funds. So now the head of retail calls the network and says, hey, why don't you start that conversation, right? Because, the Pope lived in Peru, and then there are these products. You know how it works, like conversations, humans are not perfect, but, everybody positions. Now, fast forward into the future where agentic AI manages everything. The head of retail had to call a programmer, explain the new strategy. The programmer had to understand, had to develop. He had to, or she had to, test it and then promote in production. I say by that day, there might be a new pope. So things are not necessarily instantaneous. So if you don't know how you embed in your orchestration layer the banking strategy, which is how much you want to be successful and with which constraints, you will not be able really to deploy at scale. And not many banks are thinking about that. But there's something else that is happening, Brett. Remember that my fourth book that I launched during the World Economic Forum 2019 is the Financial Market Transparency Theory. The moment you embed the business strategy into the AI algorithm, there's something magic happening that becomes transparent to everyone, also the regulator, so that the bankers will be forced to reflect on their business model and how much transparency they have in the way they position with the clients, and they will be forced to change. So they have to rediscuss the definition of value to make sure they can scale. And this is what is happening as well in terms of...
We're probably going to enter this period of radical transparency, and I'll tell you why I think that's going to happen. It's not only, I think, that social media backlash and all of that, but what we have seen with Claude Mythos is the head of the NSA in a congressional hearing 2 weeks ago said within hours of them throwing Claude Mythos at the NSA's most protected systems, it had compromised all of them, right? And if you think about what an AI that could lose all encryption, right? And access to all information becomes transparent, complete transparency. But what would that do to the world? It requires the sort of philosophical evolution of humanity. That's because once we learn all of these hidden truths and things like that, and you have a point. It's going to change our perception.
And you have a point. Now, remember, when I talk about transparency, the opposite of transparency is opacity, not privacy, okay? So for me, it's always an institutionalist approach, protect the weak and link, the citizen, and make sure that the big players, the governments, the institutions, right, are basically made accountable. But what is happening is actually this. So technology is bringing us an opportunity to reflect about what we've been doing ever since, where we got to. If we can go through that journey, we can, get out of this unscattered with a better understanding of what to do with technology and how to reposition human values and human society. So in essence, Quantum Sapiens wants to do this from a little humble starting point, which is the hard problem of consciousness that can be resolved yet in the book, but can be well discussed. But quote unquote, you can transpose it exactly into your words, an example.
Well, let's wrap it up, Paolo, because we are running out of time. But let me ask you this question. I assume that Quantum Sapiens is available on Amazon.
Quantum Sapiens is already available everywhere on Amazon and soon...
Wherever good books are sold.
Yes, soon also in the bookstores.
Okay, that's amazing. Well, if you have a book signing in a bookstore, let me know. I'll come.
Absolutely.
Wherever it is in the world. So it'd be, because it's always, it's such a cool thing to do a book signing in a bookstore.
Well,
I did it in the early days, but yeah.
Yeah, I made the book signing at the Frankfurt Book Messe.
Oh,
so
nice.
The largest book fair in the world, invited by the United Nations Development Program for the presentation of banks and fintech on platform economies. That was also cool. But the intimacy of an indie bookstore is something that I'm really missing and I would love and crave for.
Fantastic. Well, Paolo Sironi, thank you for joining us. How do people find out more information about Quantum Sapiens?
Well, they can go to Amazon or thepsironi.com. It's like the Financial Times, thepsironi.com. All information is there.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for joining us on The Futurist today.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci. Okay. That's it for The Futurist this week. It's great to have Paolo as part of the network as well with his Banker's Bookshelf podcast. You can hear more about that. We air it sometimes on Breaking Banks as well. That's it for this week. We'll see you guys in the future.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.